I'm with Mark Elliott de Lama, the owner of Fluent Finance Abroad. Hi, Mark.
Good afternoon, Alfredo. Lovely to see you.
Likewise. Thanks for joining me today. The land registry report has just come out and has tons of pretty juicy information to do with mortgages. And I thought, who better to ask than my man, Mark?
Thank you very much. We've only just received it today, and haven't really gone into it too much detail, but there's some pretty interesting bits and pieces that we can quickly go through.
Brilliant. Okay, well, let's just start with the obvious one. How many mortgages were issued in Spain last year, according to the report?
So in total, last year, there was a total of 463,406. Yeah, 463. And that's an increase of 11.2% from 2021, which is pretty big. Pre-pandemic, the total of mortgages that were granted in 2019 was 361,441. So that's over 100,000 more mortgages signed in 2022 than in 2019. The most mortgages ever granted in Spain in any given year was in 2006. And just to compare, over 1.3 million mortgages were written in 2006. So yeah, it's about 35% of that level, which is pretty interesting stat. A lot of debt was against property back then, and as we can see, that's not the case now. So whatever's going on in financial markets right at this minute, I don't think it's property related.
Right.
I don't think.
Okay, well, the figures certainly seem to support that. So, okay, going back to our 463,463 mortgages written last year, what percentage of those mortgages were to foreigners? Do you have that information?
Yeah, so 30,000.
Okay, so that's
30,000. Well, it's a little bit more, nearly 31, but 30,000, yeah, and that represents 6.8% of all mortgages that were granted in Spain. 6.85% was to foreigners.
okay. And do you have any information as to what foreigners, what the split is?
What we're looking at is non-resident, not just foreigners. So there's a lot of stats here that the largest number of foreigners were actually from Romania and Morocco.
Okay.
So we can assume that the Romanians and Moroccans currently live in Spain and are Spanish nationals and buying their main home. But apart from that, then the biggest percentage was from Great Britain, Germany, France, Holland, Sweden, Ukraine, and Poland.
Okay. So more or less what one would expect to see, no?
Yeah, Belgium was a little bit lower than anticipated. If I'm being honest, more Venezuelans bought properties in Spain than Belgians right now.
With a mortgage. Yeah.
Yeah.
So on a regional basis, how do the mortgage figures look there in terms of Andalusia, Balearics, Valencia region, that kind of stuff?
Well, Andalusia had a good year, so there's 90,000 mortgages were granted in Andalusia. Okay, in Andalusia, 9.6% more mortgages were granted. Catalonia, 15%. Madrid, 9.6%, same as Andalusia. The Valencian community is up by 12.9%. Canarias had an interesting increase of 21%.
In terms of the number of mortgages issued, last year?
Yeah, compared to the year before. But what's really interesting is that in Mallorca, we see a bigger increase of 22.1%. But the interesting stat here is that only 11,000 mortgages were granted in the Balearic Islands compared to 90,000 in Andalusia.
Right. So although the statistics in terms of percentages look hefty for the Balearics and generally do when it comes to particularly when it comes to the foreign buyer side of things, in absolute terms, it's actually quite small fry comparatively speaking.
But as we'll probably see later on in the report, the size of the mortgages are generally bigger in the Balearics. So it's still pretty important market for banks.
Okay, so now let's see if we can look at mortgages in terms of the mortgage value, the loan value. So do we have any figures for the total for Spain?
So for foreigners who are getting a mortgage in Spain, the actual average loan size is bigger. So it's sitting at 171,000 euros.
How does it compare? What's the domestic Spanish?
The domestic market, you're looking at an average mortgage of 143,000.
Okay,
So ticket values are higher for foreigners. If we consider actual physical non-residents rather than foreigners that live in Spain, I guess that would be much higher as well, but we haven't got that data. Yeah, so this is interesting as well. So the biggest mortgages that were granted last year to foreigners was in the Balearic Islands, and that's quite interesting stat. It's 370,000 euros was the average mortgage size to a foreigner in Mallorca.
And the Balearics, is that the highest in Spain or the lowest, or just?
Yeah, that's the highest. That's the highest by some way, right? And I think this kind of is kind of skewed. It's difficult to compare the Balearic Islands to the Madrid community, for example, because you know in Madrid you would have a lot of foreign nationals that actually live in Spain purchasing, and the property price of those particular properties would be much lower. So let's compare. Okay, so 370,000 euros for Mallorca and the islands. In Madrid, which is the next highest, is actually much lower at 230,000. All right, and Andalusia is just under 200,000. So Andalusia is massive compared to Mallorca and its islands. You know, you've got Sevilla, Jaén, Córdoba, Cádiz, Huelva, which again
We'll skew the figures a little bit. Yeah, we'll bring down the average. Right. Gotcha.
Yeah. Okay. In terms of nationalities, the people who are borrowing the most on their average mortgage size are the Swedes at 340,000, just under. Second come the Americans at 335,000, which is quite an interesting stat. Maybe that's because of they're in the market for the golden visas. And then we find the Germans, and then some way down in terms of average loan size are the Brits at 230, and then come the Dutch, the French, Portuguese, the Polish, and the Belgians. Okay, so we're seeing that the Swedes are buying bigger properties and getting higher mortgages.
Right, that's super interesting. So when you compare that to the national average of 140-something thousand, it's a substantial difference, which isn't a major surprise, but it's interesting to see the Americans jumping in there in the second spot, right? New entry to the charts. Well, that's brilliant. I'm sure you haven't had much time to read anything else yet because it's a huge report. But if you don't mind, I'll pick your brains again next week when you have the time to read it and see if there's any other little pieces of information you can share with us. How does that sound?
I'll try and read it in detail before I go to bed tonight. Hopefully I won't fall asleep whilst doing it, but yeah, I'll do my best.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Alfredo. Bear with me 1 second. I've got my PC guy coming.
That's all right.
Miguel. Hola. ¿Qué está pasando, tío? Mate, these people. The thing, the beauty of working in an open office. Okay. So in terms,
I love this.